By 1865, the deadliest war ever fought on American soil was all but over. And yet, the Confederacy still existed in 1865 because the Army of Northern Virginia still existed. However, the Army was crumbling just like the government it defended. Months of siege warfare drained both its strength and morale, and Robert E. Lee knew his position was untenable. However, Lee was not a man to just give up. Though the odds were nearly insurmountable, Lee still believed victory was possible and opted for one last throw of the dice. However, his final gamble was doomed to fail, and with its failure came the end of the American Civil War at Appomattox Court House. Welcome to the grand finale of our series on the American Civil War. Siege and the Big Dig begins. Both the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac dreaded a prolonged siege at Petersburg after enduring miserable trench fighting at Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. However, Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps veterans had been at Vicksburg and dreaded living in the trenches far more. Therefore, one regiment decided to break the siege. The E.A. Former coal miners of the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry believed they could dig a mine shaft under Confederate lines. Their commander and mining engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants, conducted a formal survey and concluded it was possible. He proposed digging the mine shaft from his position to the Confederate fort at Elliott's Salient, then detonating a mine to Burnside, who eagerly took it to U.S. Grant and George Meade. Grant thought Pleasant's plan was undoable, but there was no harm in letting him dig to stay busy. It was over 500 feet from the 48th's position to their target. Even if the Confederates didn't hear the mine shaft coming and dig their own countermines, engineering doctrine required easily detectable air vents in any shaft longer than 400 feet. Grant approved the plan, then forgot about it without allocating any resources. He was too occupied with operations to cut the Weldon Railroad and Early's Maryland campaign, the Big Dig. Consequently, Grant was extremely surprised when Pleasants reported the mine was completed in late July. His men had dug a 511-foot-long tunnel under Confederate lines with a 75-foot-wide galley for the explosives, using improvised tools and timber stolen from a disused bridge. They'd solved the ventilation problem by building an air exchanger using the chimney effect. The Confederates were slow to react despite quickly detecting the digging, and their countermines missed, partially due to Pleasants rerouting the tunnel away from danger. Now only the explosives were missing. Burnside had chosen Edward Ferrero's division of United States colored troops to lead the assault. Burnside was proud of his colored troops, but left them in the rear during the overland campaign on Grant's orders. Eager to demonstrate their combat abilities, Burnside spent weeks training them to lead the assault. After engineers cleared a path, the lead regiments would charge around the sides of the crater before penetrating deeply into the Confederate lines. The following regiments would sweep into the trenches beside the crater to open the gap, while engineers guided the reinforcements around the crater. The Confederate center would be broken, and if things went perfectly, Petersburg would be taken. Preparing for the blast, Grant was impressed by Burnside's preparations and approved the plan before appropriating the gunpowder for the mine. To improve the chances of a breakthrough, he ordered Hancock's corps to cross the James and attack the trenches at New Market and Glendale. Grant didn't expect a breakthrough, having instead hoped that Lee would extend his lines, thinning the defenses around Petersburg. Moreover, Sheridan's cavalry was ordered to raid Richmond if the opportunity presented itself. The July 27th attack achieved its strategic objective as Lee redeployed all his reserves to contain Hancock and Sheridan. Grant ordered the mine blown at dawn on July 30th. However, Meade believed that no matter how big a hole was blown in the rebel lines, Lee would just plug the gap and annihilate the assault force with flanking artillery. He also doubted the colored troops' fighting ability and willingness, but lacked the authority to cancel the operation. Meade instead hoped Pleasants would quietly fail and be forgotten. When he instead succeeded, Meade argued against attacking, but Grant wouldn't budge. They had a perfectly good tunnel. It would be wasteful not to use it when the plan could succeed. Out of time, Meade ordered Burnside to use a White division instead on July 29th, hoping the last-second change would force a cancellation. Burnside bitterly protested to Grant, who reluctantly sided with Meade. The Peace Democrats had made race a major campaign issue, while radical Republicans accused Lincoln of thinking black lives didn't matter. Lincoln couldn't risk political blowback from black soldiers dying like white soldiers, and had asked Grant to limit their role until after the election. Grant caved to these fears, but didn't cancel the assault, to Meade's dismay. His heart broken, Burnside morosely had his other division commanders draw straws, and disastrously, James Ledlie won. Ledlie was an incompetent drunk, and his division was thoroughly worn out from combat. Burnside carefully explained the plan to Ledlie, with orders to thoroughly brief his troops that night. Instead, Ledlie just told them to attack after the mine detonated without any details. The Battle of the Crater. The Battle of the Crater. At 03:30 on July 30th, Pleasants lit the fuse. After a false start, the mine finally detonated at 04:44. 278 Confederates died instantly, and survivors fled from the surrounding trenches. It took 15 minutes for officers to reorganize the panicked troops and begin moving back toward the trenches. Disastrously, Ledlie's demoralized and uninformed troops were equally panicked and didn't advance for 10 minutes. Worse, Ledlie hadn't sent the engineers to place footbridges over the trenches or clear debris as instructed, further slowing and disorganizing the assault. By the time they finally reached the crater, the Confederates were ready. Grant called what followed, "the saddest affair I have witnessed in this war." Ledlie's men marched at the Confederate positions rather than assault them, and were cut down. Many dove for cover in the crater, discovering too late that the sides were too steep to escape. Grant and Meade ordered the attack canceled, just as Burnside ordered Ferrero's division forward to save the situation. The colored troops heroically tried to execute the original plan, but were repelled, and many were pushed into, then trapped in, the crater. While white soldiers were taken prisoner, the Confederates summarily executed most of the blacks. Ferrero and Ledlie were found miles behind the line, drinking rum in a bunker instead of leading their troops. Union casualties stood at 3,798 to 1,491 Confederates. Burnside was scapegoated for the failure and lost his command, while Ledlie and Ferrero were castigated in a court of inquiry, causing Ledlie to resign in disgrace. However, post-war inquiries and Grant's own reports placed the blame squarely on Meade's interference. Still, the strategic situation at Petersburg remained unchanged. And the siege goes on. The Battle of the Crater was Grant's best and last chance to break through, so he simply continued the siege. For the rest of the summer and fall, Grant repeatedly extended his siege lines, stretching Lee's army to its limits. By the time the November rains halted operations, Grant's lines stretched from Mechanicsville north of Richmond to the Boydton Plank Road southwest of Petersburg. Only 2 railways connected Richmond to the outside world, and supplies began to dry up entirely. The Carolinas campaign begins. Meanwhile, in Georgia, William Sherman's Carolinas Drive T. Sherman completed his march to the sea by capturing Savannah on December 21st. Grant congratulated him, then ordered his friend to come north via the Navy to complete Lee's encirclement. However, Sherman didn't want to join that quagmire, and instead proposed to march north through the Carolinas to destroy Richmond's last supply sources. Lee's army was the only thing keeping the Confederacy alive, but Sherman believed that Lee would fight to the last. However, starving troops can't fight, and therefore, victory would come faster if he destroyed Lee's food source. Additionally, Sherman wanted there to be no doubt in Southern minds that they had lost the war, so every inch of the South had to feel the Union's wrath. To that end, he ordered George Thomas to launch a massive cavalry raid into Alabama once the weather allowed. Into South Carolina, Grant approved Sherman's plan on Christmas Eve. The remaining 10,000 Confederate soldiers in South Carolina couldn't stop Sherman's 60,000 veterans. However, they believed that the border roads being underwater would keep Sherman in Georgia until May. Sherman knew about that problem and surprised everyone. Tens of thousands of slaves had followed the march to the sea, and some were experienced swamp construction workers. Sherman formed the best of them into pioneer detachments under Union engineers to build corduroy roads and bridges while cutting new roads through the wilderness ahead of the marching columns. The pioneers got to work on December 30th, and by mid-January, Sherman was inside South Carolina. As with the march to the sea, Sherman cut his supply lines to speed his march. His men filled their packs with ammunition and little else, intending to live off the land and not resupply until they reached Fayetteville, North Carolina. Sherman gave very strict and clear orders to requisition only the food they needed. Property destruction was only to take place under their corps commander's orders in retaliation for enemy harassment. However, South Carolina was the secessionists' hotbed and the birthplace of the rebellion. The men thirsted for revenge. Many officers creatively interpreted Sherman's orders to allow wanton pillaging and destruction. Burning of Columbia. Sherman's strategic surprise was aided by speed and deception, and he faced no meaningful opposition. Despite the flooded roads and rough wilderness, Sherman's veterans advanced far too quickly for the dispersed and uncoordinated Confederates to oppose. PGT. Beauregard was so confused that he tried defending everything and ultimately defended nothing. Sherman was marching in 3 columns, with one feinting toward Augusta, another toward Charleston, and the third at his real target. The residents and defenders of Charleston self-importantly feared they were the primary target of Sherman's wrath. However, Sherman considered Charleston worthless and was instead marching to Columbia. The symbolic value of taking the state capital where the first secession vote was held was far greater than taking the city that fired the first shot. Columbia was also the last manufacturing and rail hub in the Confederacy. Lee dispatched Wade Hampton's South Carolina cavalry to defend their home state, but there was nothing he could do. Hampton abandoned Columbia on February 16th. Sherman occupied Columbia the next day, and that night, fire annihilated the business district. Lost causers long claimed that Sherman ordered Columbia burned in deliberate revenge, but Sherman gave no such order. Rather, as a 1874 newspaper column stated, "The war burned Columbia." Hampton's troopers burned several cotton stockpiles as they withdrew, and civilians threw more burning cotton into the streets as Sherman arrived. High winds carried burning sparks into buildings, quickly overwhelming Columbia's fire brigades. Additionally, citizens seeking to curry Union favor ladled out liquor to arriving troops. By nightfall, drunken soldiers were interfering with firefighting efforts and setting new fires. Worse, civilians looking to loot joined them, and rioting engulfed Columbia. Not a single business survived, and a third of Columbia was destroyed before the winds died down. The Confederacy tries to organize itself too late. Confederacy's last reorganization. As Richmond suffered through the hungry winter of 1864-65, Jefferson Davis continued to bluster about the war being winnable through Southern elan and honor. However, he couldn't obscure reality anymore. Fort Fisher's fall on January 15, 1865, cut the Confederacy's final contact with the outside world. In early February, Lee reported losing 100 men per night to desertion, with 8% of his army deserting in January alone. Union soldiers had betting pools on how many rebels would flee to their lines every night. As Sherman advanced, the Confederate garrisons in South Carolina fled into North Carolina rather than fight. While it was far too late to matter, the Confederate Congress finally took the war out of Davis's hands and voted to make Lee general-in-chief and return Joseph Johnston to Western Command. Davis reluctantly appointed Lee on February 6th, but adamantly refused to appoint Johnston, as he would rather lose the war than admit he had been wrong. Nevertheless, Lee forced the issue and Johnston returned to command on February 25th. Congress also considered but rejected recruiting slaves in exchange for freedom. Regardless of their manpower crisis, Southerners preferred losing the war to surrendering their slaves. Lee makes a plan. Lee knew Richmond was doomed. He understood that his 40,000 regulars and 10,000 Virginia militia could not resist Grant's spring offensive, and he had to escape before then. Johnston suggested linking up. Together, they had the numbers to defeat Sherman and then try to wait out Grant in the North Carolina mountains. Lee initially declined, but in March, he realized it was the only hope remaining. He further believed that defeating Sherman would restore morale enough for them to turn back then and defeat Grant as they had in 1862. Thus, he began preparations to evacuate the trenches and flee south as soon as the weather allowed. Johnston wasn't as sanguine. Sherman's 60,000 men were rapidly advancing. The 15,000-man Army of the Ohio had been redeployed to take Wilmington and was marching inland to link up with Sherman at Greensboro, opposed by 9,000 men under Braxton Bragg. Johnston had William Hardee's 10,000 men from South Carolina, about 8,000 cavalry, and the 6,600 Army of Tennessee diehards who hadn't deserted after Nashville. To have a chance, he needed Sherman to make a mistake. Sherman enters North Carolina. Sherman's scorch marks ended sharply at the North Carolina border. This state had been a reluctant rebel and tens of thousands of tar. Heels had joined the Union Army, which meant that Sherman's men weren't interested in revenge when they entered on March 8th. Sherman was moving in 2 columns to make his rendezvous with Schofield and wasn't expecting any resistance. All the evidence indicated that the remaining Southern soldiers' morale was too poor to fight anymore. However, Johnston had again worked tirelessly to restore his men to fighting form. After absorbing Bragg's force, Johnston's new Army of the South had just enough soldiers to take on one of Sherman's columns if, and only if, they were too far apart to support each other. He couldn't destroy Sherman, but if he damaged one wing enough or destroyed its supply wagons, Sherman would have to fall back to the coast to reorganize, buying Lee enough time to escape Grant. Battle of Bentonville. On March 15th, Sherman's cavalry found Hardee's men guarding Averasboro. The left column moved into position and attacked, overwhelming 2 lines of breastworks before being halted by a third. Overwhelming Union numbers forced Hardee to retreat, but while the left was delayed, Sherman's right column continued advancing. This was the opportunity Johnston was looking for, as it appeared that the columns were more than a day's march apart. As Slocum's men marched up the Goldsboro Road, they encountered Johnston's army south of Bentonville. Thinking it was only a cavalry screen backed by artillery, Slocum attacked with a single division. After it was strongly repulsed, he fell back and called for help, though he didn't order breastworks built. At 15 Wacht, the Army of Tennessee attacked the Union left. Not expecting the Confederates to show their old fighting spirit, the flank collapsed. Only one division held thanks to its commander's insistence on fortifying his position, preventing Johnston from getting to Slocum's rear. Reinforcements began arriving, and Johnston pulled back. Rather than retreat, he fortified his position, hoping Sherman would repeat Kennesaw Mountain. Instead, they spent the 20th lightly skirmishing. Sherman was weary of war and wanted all his men to survive to celebrate the victory he knew was close, so he didn't attack. A reconnaissance in force nearly turned Johnston's flank on the 21st, but poor communication led Sherman to recall the force, a decision he later admitted was wrong. That night, Johnston wired Lee that he could not stop Sherman without help. The Appomattox Campaign ignites. Lee knew that he had to leave, but conditions were terrible. As hungry and exhausted as his men were, the Army-AS draft animals were worse and weren't capable of hauling wagons or artillery on wet roads. However, Lee knew time was running out. Federal cavalry, once again under Philip Sheridan, was stepping up raids against his supply lines. Lee was unaware that Grant had set March 29th as the start date of his final campaign. Battle of Fort Stedman. Hoping to forestall Grant and force him to contract his lines, Lee authorized an attack on Fort Stedman. At 04:15 on March 25th, sharpshooters and engineers disguised as the nightly deserter run moved into no man's land. The Union forces were caught by surprise, their pickets quickly killed, and the Confederates cleared the physical obstructions. 3 100-man assault teams infiltrated and captured batteries 10 to 12 plus Fort Stedman. They were then supposed to continue into the Union rear to disrupt counterattacks while the main force moved up, but instead, the starving soldiers fell out to feast on abandoned Union breakfasts. The alert was quickly raised, and by 07:30, Union reinforcements contained the breakthrough. At 07:45, a punishing counterattack drove the Confederates back to their lines after losing over 4,000 men and only inflicting 1,000 casualties. By the time Grant learned of the attack, it was already over, and he went about his day as normal, which included a formal parade for the visiting President Lincoln. However, Lee knew he had wasted his last offensive potential. His fate was sealed. On March 27th, Lincoln met with Grant and Sherman to discuss the war's end. Lincoln told both men to give generous terms. No political concessions were to be made, but both should let the defeated rebels go home. The war had been hard enough, and Lincoln wanted a soft, reconciliatory peace. Battle of Five Forks. Sheridan's cavalry and Warren's 5th Corps moved against Lee's right flank on March 29th. After probing Lee's defenses on March 31st, they broke through at Five Forks. George Pickett's division had been ordered to hold at all costs. Still, not expecting a late afternoon assault after receiving no scouting reports, the senior officers had left to attend a shad bake. Acoustic shadows prevented them from returning until it was too late, but overwhelming Federal numbers most likely doomed the defenders even if they had been led. This effectively cut the South Side Railroad, Lee's main supply line. He informed Davis that the fall of Richmond was imminent. Grant breaks through. The next day, Grant attacked along the entire Petersburg line. Longstreet's corps successfully defended the Petersburg trenches, but A.P. Hill's corps broke along the Boynton Plank Road. Hill rode out to try and rescue the situation, only to ride upon Union stragglers who ignored his order to surrender and shot him. Learning of the breakthrough, Lee knew Petersburg and Richmond were lost. He informed Davis that he would be evacuating that night. Davis's government took the remaining Treasury bullion and their important documents and fled to Danville. Everything else was burned, and soon Richmond was put to the torch so that the Yankees couldn't claim it as a prize. About 40,000 troops slipped away in the dark and marched for Amelia Court House. Lee had ordered all remaining food stores to be waiting for them there. He'd feed his troops, then look for a way around Grant to reach Johnston. Grant expected Lee to fight to the death in Richmond, and his men attacked empty trenches on April 3rd. Sheridan was immediately ordered to find Lee while the infantry cleared the cities. Lincoln came to observe the smoldering Confederate capital on April 4th and was mobbed by a large gathering of grateful former slaves. The Chase Sheridan discovered the Confederates moving west late on April 3rd. Grant didn't know where Lee was headed, but if he escaped Virginia, it would be disastrous. Sheridan was ordered to keep Lee north of the South Side Railroad. Every Union unit was in pursuit. While Lee's troops successfully rendezvoused at Amelia Court House, the food had been mistakenly sent to Danville. Starving soldiers fell out to forage, and Lee lost his head start. While waiting for them to return, Lee abandoned about a third of his wagons and artillery as the horses were too tired to go on. Sheridan's main force caught up that night. As Lee began fleeing west on April 5th, Sheridan hounded his column, slowing Lee's march and letting the infantry catch up. He also managed to get a division into position to block Lee's road to Danville, leaving Lynchburg as his only escape route. To reach it, he'd have to cross Sailor's Creek via 2 narrow bridges. This choke point allowed the infantry to catch and assault the rear guard along with Sheridan's cavalry. Attacked from 3 sides, 7,700 Confederates were killed or captured, including their commander, Richard Ewell. Watching the disaster unfold, Lee despaired but chose to press on. Lee continued marching for Lynchburg, trying and failing to stall his pursuers through cavalry actions and destroying bridges. Grant doggedly kept the infantry after him, while Sheridan constantly found routes around obstructions. On April 8th, George Custer's cavalry division got ahead of Lee's army and seized Appomattox Station, capturing or destroying all the supplies waiting for Lee.